Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lawrence Schimel. I'll be moderating today's panel on a single title's journey into English. Although, while we'll be focusing on one particular title, we'll be using that as the launching point to sort of explore how a book gets picked up to be translated into English. Every book's journey is unique in many ways, even multiple books by a single author, as we'll discuss on the panel. So. An ironic thing about I'm an author, a translator from Spanish into English, and also a publisher of A Midsummer Night's Press, which also does have an imprint called Periscope that publishes poetry and translation by women writers. So I touch on all of the areas that the panel will be discussing. The panel was originally conceived to have this panel each day of the fair, but focusing on a different team, publisher, translator, and author, to explore or to really show all the different ways that a book can wind up being translated into English. So in the end, it's only this one panel, so we're going to hopefully explore as much as possible. And I do want to leave some time at the end for questions, so we'll talk quickly but thoroughly. So briefly, I will introduce the panelists. So Juan Villoro, who is our guest from Mexico. He's one of the preeminent writers in Mexico. He's done over 20 books that he's published, 10 for children and young adults and 15 for adults. He's won many awards, has been translated into French, Korean, Japanese, German, Italian, Portuguese, Serbian, Turkey, very well known all over the world, and is finally being published in English. So next to Juan is Tom Bunstead, who will be translating a book of his nonfiction about, I'm American, so I would say soccer, but here in the UK, it would be football. So, and that's something that, Tom will talk about, that linguistic difference of how that's going to be translated. And let me just give you some more bio info on him. He's translated Eduardo Halfán, Yuri Herrera, Enrique Villamatas, among other writers, and he just co-edited with Sophie Hughes for Words Without Borders, a special issue focusing on Mexican writing. So that's available online, which came out last month in March. So, and we have at the end of the table Joshua Ellison, who is an editor at Restless Books, who will be publishing the collection of of essays. He's the founder of Habitus, an international journal of diaspora culture, and has also been a journalist for many different publications. So while a book begins with its author, in our first round of questions, I'm actually going to end with our author. And so I'd like to start by asking Joshua some questions about how did this book come to your attention, and how did Restless decide to publish it?
Sure. Before the book came to our attention, Juan came to our attention, and my partner in Restless Books, Ilan Stavans, has known Juan for a long time, and they've collaborated before in Spanish, and we're admirers. So we had it in mind that we wanted to publish something of his, and we had a few manuscripts had come across, and it hadn't happened yet, but we always kind of assumed it would. And in the last year or so, we've been developing more of our nonfiction list. And nonfiction books in translation have some particular challenges. One has to be something, especially when with the idea we want things that are about the contemporary world, it has to be contemporary, but it also has to survive what's usually a few years of lag between a original language publication and a translation. So it either needs to be a subject that can endure that kind of thing, or there has to be updates from the author. It's a little bit of a different challenge than doing a novel, for example. And also it has to be a topic that we think we can present to an American audience, that an English language audience that sort of is on their menu of topics they're interested in, and it's a small list, frankly. So we these two books, what was originally two books, and that's something else we should talk about, came to our attention really just I think we had been doing another title with Planeta, and kind of in browsing the catalog saw this and said, okay, this looks like, here's an author we know we want to publish, and this looks like the kind of subject matter that might fit our bill for finding some, smart nonfiction that we can bring out to an audience that, will be receptive to it.
Mm-hmm. Do you yourself speak Spanish, or what languages do you speak?
I can fake it. I can read. I'd say for content, not for style. So I don't. But
Ilan, your co-editor,
yeah,
obviously.
And we have
a book together.
Yeah.
Last year
We have a bunch of languages in the office, between us. So we get by, and we rely on translators, for advice and judgment. And I'm trying to think how I connected with you, Tom. I think was it through Will? Was that what it was? Yeah. So Will Evans, Facebook. I think, introduced us. What? For Facebook, of course, right? Thank you, Facebook, and thank you, Will. I think you got in touch and Will had...
Yeah. A mutual... Hello? Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me all right at the back? Not? I'm getting slight shakes of the head. Can this go up a bit? Okay. The only book that I translated where Facebook has sort of been partly responsible. I saw a mutual publishing friend mentioned something about having sort of missed out on or having been close to acquiring a certain selection of football essays by one of my favourite writers. So I got in touch with him. I sent him a private message saying, so did someone else commission it? And they put me in touch with these guys, and it sort of went from there.
Right. And so from there it was pretty straightforward, because all the parties were interested and excited to do it, and in the catalog it was originally two collections in Spanish, and I'll leave it to you guys to say a little bit what distinguishes them. But our feeling was that we were going to do one volume that kind of collected from the two. It was a chance for us to tailor a little bit to the audience, and that's what I'll say for now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so was the experience of this book different from other translated titles that Restless has a very strong translation focus. Yes. How was the experience of finding, one thing you knew that this was an author you were interested in, but you actually found it from the publisher's catalog, or the publisher pitched it to you, or how are some of the other translations?
In this case, we found it in the publisher's catalog. I wasn't aware of this book, even though I was aware of the author. I'm not sure there is a typical route. This is one of the routes.
This is one of the routes. What are some of the ways, if we could just explain some of the other books, how some of the other Restless books have come to you.
I would say either it's an author where there's either an author we're looking at, a publisher that we're watching what they're doing, an agent that we've established a relationship who has a good read on our tastes. Those are the main channels, and translators. Translators are another major source of scouting,
which come through recommendations, as in the case with Tom, or meeting at the translator center, all these different things.
No two stories are exactly alike, but those are sort of I think those are the main channels. And, there are also things that we've just sort of found in our journeys on the internet that we'll track down and sometimes we'll initiate.
Or things like, I know that Restless has a science fiction, Latin American science fiction.
Yeah, well, we have specifically a Cuban series.
Science fiction.
That was, an unusual amount of serendipity, which involved, we found one writer who then kind of opened the doors to the rest of the genre to us. And because it's Cuban, there's all kinds of special circumstances, but we'll have to do another panel on that, because it's worth it.
Okay.
But for the most part, we were already doing a project with Planeta. We were already in touch with the rights director. So again, once we found what we were looking for, it was straightforward. And then just at the right time, a translator showed up. So it all worked out very nicely.
So then, the projects that originate with translators, obviously those translators would be the project, but
mostly, but not always. There are translators that we talk to who tell us about books besides the ones they're working on, and that may end up being with somebody else. And we think of translators as real ambassadors to the host culture and language, and so we always ask. When I talk to translators, I always ask, what's the one book you've always wanted to translate that nobody's ever given you a chance to do before, and that's that's a great source there. And
you haven't asked me that yet.
Well, we just met.
Although that's a perfect transition for.
But yeah, in the question and answer section.
So Tom, you spoke a little bit about how your involvement in the project came about. That you'd seen a mention of this book. I know you. The book is a. Did we talk about this yet, or do you want to explain what the book is a little bit, since you've been working on it so intimately?
Yeah.
Why don't you explain?
And maybe say what the two books were and what the.
And what the one new book is going to be.
Yeah, sure. So in fact, yeah, it comes from two collections. One called Dios es Redondo, and one called Balón y Cabeza. One's an interesting writer. He's an interesting person to be writing about football. He's not really the kind of football writing that you see in the UK, or I would say really. I should perhaps mention, I don't know, that I sort of said this to Restless when I first got in touch. I've worked a bit in sports journalism. I worked for Real Madrid TV in the past, and I do sports translations from time to time, and I'm a bit addicted to football. And
so you're the perfect person to do this.
Well, that was the case.
And a literary translator
yeah.
from Spanish as well as the football.
And I'm sports illiterate, so it was actually really extremely helpful.
And I mean that there is a certain literacy that's required for the football idiom, which maybe we could. Well, I mean, I've got a couple of case examples that we could go into maybe, but but also, I'm a literary translator. And also this writing's very literary. It's the psychoanalysis of what it is to be a fan. It's got Walter Benjamin. It's got Javier Marias. I've forgotten what the question was.
The question was to tell us, to explain what the book is a collection of essays drawn from two books that were originally published in Spanish that are then becoming one book.
Yeah.
Was the selection done by Restless, or have you been going
Ilan
through?
Did it, right?
It was Ilan and maybe in conversation with.
Okay.
I mean, I think they wanted stuff that had as much contemporary resonance. This is writing that's collected. Juan's sort of collected football essays from over many years. So they wanted things that would, they sort of made a selection for things that they thought would work for a single book.
And I know you've been having there were some translation issues involving just expressing literarily the football terminology, but also the US-UK, which was some of the stuff we touched on, whether it's football or whether it's soccer. It's Restless as a US-based, but especially a publisher that does a lot with digital first and then print, and the digital has a global reach.
Yeah.
So,
and I also wouldn't be surprised if this book ended up with much more of a focus on the UK market, because
soccer
of the
is
popularity
football
of
is
the sport. So this may be one where we kind of tilt the other way. That'll be a decision we make as we start to edit.
I mean, for now, I'm writing it with a US audience. I'm not writing it, in fact. It's already been written. But I've got a US audience in mind. And, soccer is growing in popularity. It's very much not the most popular sport in the States. But there, aside from just not being able to say the word football, which also can sort of stymie you when you want to... There's also certain constructions like... using footballing, you have to sort of work back around that. One example that I thought I might raise was the word jugada. So for an American audience, it's very much acceptable. So this is jugada is like a play, but it can be like a team play, like a team move, or it can be an individual sort of initiating something and making a play kind of happen. And actually, as I say it to you now, play, I think I'm sort of seeing nods kind of make sense to people. It's not a word that would be used in the UK, in UK football writing.
What would the equivalent be?
Well, you'd have to do a workaround, and actually, most of my the bits of sports translation that I've done over the last couple of years have been for an American soccer website. So I'm actually really sort of au fait with these kinds of issues. So there's this sort of general, there's the football and the US facing aspect. And then there's the fact of it being very literary. And while I've been working on it, did anyone here know the writer Barney Ronay, writes for The Guardian? And Jonathan Wilson. Now, I think these guys are, I mean, they write for The Guardian, they're football writers, but they're frustrated novelists. They're brilliant writers. They're wonderful prose stylists. And I've basically sort of had them in my mind to try and sort of, they have a wonderful kind of rhetorical bounce that I think Juan's work kind of also has. So I've just been, you know, maybe halfway through the day when you're starting to get a bit cloudy, kind of like dropping out and reading an article or reading one of Jonathan Wilson's longer form things, and just have that sort of in mind to try and hang the voice on a little bit. So yeah.
And how has the experience of being involved as a translator in this project been different from other books that you've translated? You know, have they been projects that you sent a pitch to a publisher? Have they been publishers coming to you? As in this case, you did go to Restless, but given your history as a soccer translator and a literary translator, you would have been an ideal translator for them to come to you in this particular case.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's different. I mean, as Joshua said, there's sort of no one route. But I've had books that I've translated where I've been asked to do a sample. I've been positive about it. Sorry, I've been asked to do a report. Been positive about it. Then been asked to do a sample, and it just goes ahead. That's kind of the most straightforward thing from a translator's point of view. There was a little bit of a U-bend sort of in there to begin with. And then it was a question of doing, or, you know, we got in touch and I did a sample for them. I've sort of, yeah. I mean, you know, in other cases, there's books that I've sort of been advocating for a while.
Have those mostly been successful? Have you found publishers for them, or you're still shopping them, or, you know, I mean, how typical is it that the projects you're advocating for?
Not very typical, as you know yourself. I mean, it's great to be able to answer that, you know, to be able to answer the question like what book would you love to do and be excited about books. But by and large, it's the other way around. Publishers have kind of already found something. They'll ask for your advice, doing reports and so on, but it will have come to them via networks that are, I guess, you know, I've been in this game for sort of 4 or 5 years or something. You know, the publishers' networks, I'm sort of not in that established kind of network of really feeding them books, I would say. Yeah, it more comes the other way around.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just one thing which I don't think I mentioned at the beginning, but when I was asked to moderate the panel, it was because, you know, I am an author, a translator, and also a publisher, so I have experience on all of these. And without knowing it, I've actually translated a book of Juan's as well. It's a very different situation, but I do a lot of work with Ediciones SM in Spain for their rights department. So they commission samples from the novels that win their Young Adult Award every year and a translation of the picture book. And Juan had won, one of his picture books was one of the ones that I actually translated for the rights department. So I've translated a book of Juan's that hasn't been published and doesn't have a publisher yet for his Spanish language publisher, who needed the sample to be able to shop it to other publishers who might not read Spanish. You know, and so this is sort of like what you know, Joshua found it in a catalog. Some publishers do commission samples. Sometimes agents commission samples. These are some of the ways also that, or some of the other ways that we haven't yet touched on of how a book can make it or can get halfway through the system. You know, I mean, like I've translated a book of his that so far nobody is publishing. I don't know if they've sold it. I don't think they've sold that picture book elsewhere.
Korea.
So the Korean publisher, I imagine, read the English and then translated off of that. You know, that's something that's typical where, you know, and it's also possible that an English language publisher may buy rights to the book and have their own translator do a translation. They may not like my translation. They may prefer a British translator or an Australian translator, depending on who it is who picks that up. So those are just some other, just something to mention as well. So. we'll come to the author, the person who makes it possible for us to get excited about a book and want to translate it. Do we have a title yet for the collection in, do you know what, because it's 2 books becoming
Right.
one?
Well, we love the title God is Round, which is really one collection, but so I think that's what we've been using as our working title, but
Okay.
we've, it's not final, but yeah, let's call that the title.
Okay. So God is Round is not actually your first book that's being published in English. Do you have the copy that we can?
Yes.
So your first to appear in English was The Guilty, which was published by George Brasilier and translated by Kimi Traub. Traub? My
It should
apologies.
be, German. In German, is Traube.
Traube. Okay. So how has this experience with the Restless collection been different from the earlier experience? If you could talk about both of those.
Yes. Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be here. This is the first time we are all of us coming together. So we have to thank the London Book Fair for this opportunity to meet my publisher, my translator, and my former translator as well. I am very fond of translators, not only because they are the victims that are in charge of my words in other language, but because I am a translator myself. I have translated some books from the German language, and I know how difficult it is to translate, and it's very, very punishing sometimes to render the soul, the world, the language of another author in your own language. And I think that a good translator expands the possibilities of his own culture through the influence of the original author. So I think to a certain extent a translator is an author as well. Maybe it's a kind of a shy author, but nonetheless he's an author. So I'm very happy to be here with 2 translators. And the experience of being published in the United States with a book on soccer, it's quite stunning for me because the United States has always been a foreign land to soccer. No? One of the main illusions and fantasies of the soccer fan in Mexico is to defeat the United States. And that was one of the only fields in which we could defeat the United States, but in the last years that has become much more difficult. So, when we play the United States, even if we play in Detroit, Chicago, New York, we are always the local team because all the fans are Mexicans.
Yeah, I was going to say, we're basically Mexicans
exactly,
now. So
illegal aliens who fill the stadiums, no? And you can see images of the Holy Virgin of Guadalupe, the national flag, and so on. So it's like being in Mexico, guacamole all around, no? In the pitch. And, well, it's a Mexican fiesta, but the score has been a tragedy for us in the last years. And I'm very happy to have a British translator because, of course, the football culture is very, very strong in this country. I like very much some sports journalists from Great Britain. You mentioned a couple of them. Also, writers like Nick Hornby, for example. No, Fever Pitch is a fantastic rendition of a guy whose idea of the world has to do with the team he loves. So being a fan of football is not an easy task, especially if you support a loser team. So when you support a very weak team, you have the chance to become like a stoic philosopher because you are going to face adversity all over your life. So this is a school in resignation, in frustration, and I have written a lot about this, but this happens to be most of the time a very local issue, no? Because my team is now it's not even in the first division. It's not even in our Premier League. It's in the underworld where the very, very bad teams play. So this is very, very interesting for people like me and for very few fans because this team has very few supporters. But maybe that's not that interesting for an international reader. So we choose essays that resemble the international aspects of soccer. So profiles on very well-known figures, no, like Diego Armando Maradona, for example, or Messi, all the great Brazilians from Pelé to Rivaldo, Romario, no, the Barcelona from Pep Guardiola, and so on. There are some stories who can stay as they are for many years. For example, I wrote a piece on this terrible drama of the goalkeeper of the German national team, Robert Enke, who committed suicide some days before the South African World Cup. It's a very moving and depressing and dramatic story, but that's already a story in itself. It's an accomplished story that's not going to change. But there are others stories that need a kind of update. No? So we decided to choose stories that were more actual, that had more to do with the current situation of soccer, to update, and other ones, and to find the stories that could travel better. In itself, the selection is a kind of translation, because we were choosing such stories that can ring a bell for the international reader. No, if you say Maradona, well, you can know something, especially if you're from Great Britain and you remember the man of God, the hand of God.
And how involved in your translations are you? I mean, as a translator yourself, I mean, are you in contact with the translators from the various countries that you've been translated into so far, as well as with Kimi and Tom? I know with Tom you definitely are, but if you can just talk about that process.
Yes. Well, the first situation is to get in touch with the translator. And for example, so far, we have discussed some doubts from Thomas, and not very much. I mean, I think he understands perfectly well the world of soccer itself and what I'm trying to deliver, what I'm trying to say, the style, because I tend to write in a way I would like that this narrative has also a literary effect, no? I'm not writing a short story, but the tension of the essay sometimes has the dramatics of a short story, or tries to resemble some forms of the epic tradition, no? Even the Homeric tradition. So, and in Latin America we have this kind of speakers that are like Homero. They are really into a rapsody of the game, no? And they get emotionally involved, and I like very much these improvisations of the epic possibilities of soccer. So I try to render, to a certain extent, through my prose, this kind of emotional effect of the great Latin American speakers. That's a very interesting oral tradition in our culture. So I know that Thomas has has an ear for this, and that's very important for me. But we are now at the first stage, no? And then I think we were going to cover the second stage, which is very important for me, and it's to have my own doubts. So to read the translation and say, do you think this is the best solution, and so on. So I can read English. Of course, there are some nuances that I'm not aware of, but I think I can have a feeling of the language and so on. So first, he has the doubts. Now, at the second phase, I am to have these doubts and to make questions to my translator.
And was that also the case with Kimi, with the guilty?
Yes. Well, she didn't have any doubts. He used to live in Mexico, no? And she knows very well the Mexican slang. There's a lot of dialogue here. But then the publisher had some doubts. Mm-hmm. So I started the process with the publisher. I think that's also very interesting. For example, in Latin America, the publisher doesn't have a heavy hand for corrections. Mm-hmm. So he doesn't get that involved. And I like very much the British and the American publisher that is aware not only of the text but of the possibilities of the text. So that sometimes he says, well, you can cut here, you can develop a little more, this is confusing, and so on. And I like that kind of work very much. So I started working with the publisher, Lexi Freiman from George Brasiler, and then I read the translation and I had my own doubts, no?
Uh-huh. And is this similar? I mean, the two languages that you speak very well would be English and German, and I know you've also been translated into German. Is it a different experience than when you're translated into Japanese or into French or other languages that you don't speak? Are you in touch with those translators as well? Do they write to you with questions?
No, I just worship somebody who can translate me into Japanese. But you know, for example, the German translator, she's extraordinary, Susanne Lange. She translated recently Don Quixote, the new version, and she won the National Award for Translation. So the only kind of reactions I have from her is like some complaints on something about style, solutions, some things she thinks are not very well developed. So it's more or less that kind of. She remembers my teachers at the German school. She remembers my teachers.
Okay. And are you, I mean, especially as a translator, are you aware at all of translation when you're writing? Or has the experience of being translated ever changed how you write? I mean,
this is almost a philosophical question. It's a very important one. I think it's very dangerous for a writer to think about the possible translation because he's going to simplify his work. I think you have to have an ear for clarity. That's very important, at least for me. I think literature has to be readable. And I think one of the greatest mysteries in prose is that you can achieve a very clear prose that at the same time is a form of mystery. So for example, when you read a page by Borges, you understand everything. The language is extremely pure. And at the same time, when you finish reading, that was so clear to you is a form of the enigma. You have second thoughts, no? And I think that's the best effect in literature. So I have a very, I am very aware of clarity, but I don't think that much about the possibility of being translated. And then when a translator asks me something, I say, oh God, how was I able to write such a complicated sentence, no? But well, it happens that way. I have translated very, very difficult German authors, for example, and I know they would be not as good if they would oversimplify their work. No?
Can you just briefly explain how, I mean, I know George Brasiler did the short story collection and has 2 novels in the works. Can you explain how that came about and whether you were involved in that or whether that was sort of out of your hands? You write the books and then they get sold by your publishers or your agent?
No, I wrote the books and I have to thank the translator, Kimi Traube, she was living in Mexico. She read the book in Mexico. She knew about my work in Mexico. We never met. And then she was like my ambassador. I didn't know. Sometimes translators do that. And I mean, they are like pioneers. For example, I was talking about Susanne Lange. The first translation she did was a gigantic novel by Fernando del Paso, a Mexican author. It's a novel almost 1,000 pages long. She didn't have a contract to do the translation, and she was so sure that the work was a masterpiece that she translated the whole book and went to a publishing house, and it was fantastic. And of course, it was such an act of love that then the making of the translation was a piece for the press as well, because it was such an interesting story. So sometimes translators are like that, no? And Kimi took the book to the States, and she convinced George Brasiler. They got in touch with me, and I asked them, it was like a wild guess on my part. I asked them, would it be possible to have a long-term relationship this is very difficult to get, especially in another language, no? And so we started to speak about what I was writing, all of my books, and they decided to take 3 of my books. And that was really, really rewarding for me, because then we can plan on the long run, we can choose different translators, we can decide which book is better to start and then have a second book and so on. And one of them is very long, so that's the third one that is going to appear. So it has been very, very interesting to have a package of books.
Mm-hmm. I know, Joshua, that the book that you're doing of Juan's hasn't yet come out, but can you talk about sort of what is the process with a translated book once the book is published? You know, we've been talking about the pre-publication, some of how the book gets out, but sort of what happens with a book in translation when it's published in the English language market?
Well, in the case of this book, this is in some ways an opportunity to reach a very different kind of audience than one often finds with translated books. I don't want to make too much of the sort of category of the translated book as a particular kind of publishing experience. I think it's one aspect of, with a lot of other variables. And I think we don't as a sort of semantic matter, we don't talk about our works as books in translation. We talk about them as international books, because to me the translation is a process issue, and from a reader's perspective, But
I think it does. I mean, in this case, Juan has excellent English. Not all of the authors that you're publishing or that are published in translation have English, and so I don't know.
Right.
I don't think that for Restless this is an issue, but for some publishers, I think that only authors who do have English that can tour. Those are authors that are easier to translate in some ways, or easier to promote in translation than.
It's true. I would say it's. I mean, it's the advantage of an author with, who's really fluent in English, is even deeper than that. I'd say, the fact that we're able to have Juan participating so actively in this process is only possible because his English is as good as it is. And, as an editor and as publishers, the willingness and ability of an author to participate gives us a broader range of possibilities for shaping a work. In translation circles, there are definitely camps on this, and whether or not one should just do exactly as the published text was originally versus something more interpretive. And I'm fairly agnostic on it. I think it really depends on the situation, but certainly we feel a lot more liberty to come back and rethink a project like this when the author is so involved. When an author is not involved or not available or not able to participate in English, our tendency is to be much more conservative in the kind of interpretations that we do.
And how involved are the translators of the books, of the international books that you published, involved in the post-publication activity or the life of the book? I mean, so, as Juan was saying, how, Kimi was so involved in being the ambassador for this book. Are the translators taking part, or just the authors, in the post-publication?
Also varies enormously. There's some translators who really have that skill set, and they are great public advocates. Others, that's not their interest or their skill set, and so it really is driven by the translator. It's certainly an asset. Mm-hmm. But even when the translator is not a public face for the project, we do, as I said before, we think of the translators as ambassadors to the culture. So they're often really important in connecting us with resources, institutions, press. They have a read on a culture in a way that in many cases we don't. So their experience is really valuable to us, and sometimes it's in a public way and sometimes it's not. But I would say in almost all cases we've had really involved translators who stayed involved. Uh-huh. That's been our experience.
Tom, has your experience as a translator with the other books that you've already published been similar to that, what Joshua is describing, or has it been less, even though you're the voice of these authors in English, whether you're continuing to be their voice or represent them, or whether it's only through the print and then...
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say representing, but post publication certainly. Books that I've had, I've make sure. I mean, I'm also a reviewer, so I know people who are also reviewers and work on literary desks. So I make sure, particularly the books that I've been really keen on, that if a certain reviewer isn't in contact with the press department of that publishing house, that they know they're going to get a book. So I try to make sure that the book is going to be reviewed, and then when they're reviewed, I'm a recent Twitter convert, so I'll follow my authors, and then if there's anything kind of about them, then I'm just kind of trying to create more of a swell around it by pressing a few buttons. And then I guess with a couple of the books there have been, thinking particularly of Eduardo Alfon, there was.
With the Polish boxer.
Yeah, a book called The Polish Boxer, which Pushkin did here. It was a co-translation. Myself and a slew of other translators did it together. There was a few events that were put on afterwards, and I can't claim to have made them happen, but that's a really nice way as well that you can contribute to sort of the life of the book.
Yeah, we've had a couple of recent cases where translators were also very helpful in translating other press materials and reviews, and that stuff those are really helpful to have in our advocacy of the book to the distributor and the sales force and the booksellers, and so that's.
This is just also for
really
people to know
valuable.
that the translator's work doesn't end just when they finished the text. Very often in the publishing process, the translators do tend to be involved in the long-term life of the book, which exists, which starts long before the publication and often doesn't end.
Well, just to slightly go back to also, the point that you made earlier on, like you did a sample of one of Juan's books, so that a publisher could have it to go out into the world with. I just did that for the first time last week, a book that I'm going to be translating. I sort of did the first 10 pages so that the publisher could have it here. It's kind of another interesting little part that a translator can play in getting the book beyond English, English as a bridge.
No, I mean, English also as a global language. I mean, Spanish is a widely spoken language, but I know this as I write in both Spanish and English, and the books that I write in Spanish, very often, if I don't do my own self-translation into English, I can't sell them abroad a lot of times. So my Icelandic publisher, for instance, translated off of my own English edition, not off of the Spanish. So very often I found that the books that I've written directly in Spanish, except in one case where a book I wrote in Spanish was translated into English by someone else, by Groundwood, a Canadian publisher, and they did that in part because as a Canadian publisher, if they have a Canadian translator, they got a grant from the Canada Council for the Arts. In that case also, the publisher had sold the rights, and the Canadian publisher had bought the rights and translated the book before I found out that it had been translated. So, I mean, this is sort of one of the things I was saying, how, even though the books all start with the author, very often we are the least involved in the whole process. So what has your experience been with the various translations, both in English and some of the other languages you've been translated into, whether you get invited to speak in Japan or in Korea, or, which are the furthest away in my mind from Mexico. But what has that participation been like for you?
No, of course, if you have a translation, you travel in another way as an author, no? Because there's the book, and they invite you more often, and it opens you a lot of doors. I wanted to say one thing about, from the perspective of the author, the English translation, of course, is extremely important. It's instrumental, and this has to do with the geopolitics of languages. And we all know that the new lingua franca in the world is, of course, English. It's very difficult to get an English translation because we are countries, Spanish-speaking countries, we try to think about ourselves as living in the outskirts of progress. So we have a very, very strong translations tradition. We need to translate to be in contact, in touch with modernity, with civilization. On the other way around, the center of the modern world speaks English, so they don't need translations to survive. And so it's
is a philosophical question.
Exactly. Well, we are here among translations who think otherwise, no? But normally it's very, very difficult to get a translation. But when this happens, it's extremely important for the author, much more so than other translations, because you have to take into account that this translation into English is going to be at the same time, and you were addressing this issue, it's going to be like the shadow translation for other languages. And I can assume that the translator to Romanian, if that happens in the future, he's going to have the possibility to check the English translations to find a solution. Most of the translators in the world, they speak at least some English. So this is like going to be the matrix for all the other translation. It's not the definitive translation, because that thing doesn't exist, but it's as close as it can be. So that's why many writers, they try to be involved with the English version, because it's like the blueprint for all other translations.
No, I mean, as a publisher of poetry and translation by women writers, we've seen this where two of the books that we've published, one by a Slovenian writer, some of it is not just that the translation in this case, there was a Spanish editor who doesn't read Slovenian but read the English edition and decided to publish it, and then found a direct Spanish to Slovenian translator. One of our poets, an Estonian poet, Caitlin Kaldma, who happens to be in the audience, her book, she was invited to the Cairo Book Festival because the organizer of the festival was able to read in English, even though there is also an Arabic translation that came out after that, but I think that was through the English translation because there was no direct Estonian to Arabic translator. So very often the English can open doors. Hopefully other language publishers will be able to read Juan's work, both what Restless is publishing and the books coming out from George Brazilier, who might not read in Spanish, even if they can then find a Spanish to German translated directly or Spanish to whatever other language, but the monolingual editors or editors who don't necessarily speak Spanish, the English edition is a way of their... So we have 10 minutes for questions from the audience. And we have a microphone, so if people would have questions up front.
Sorry, but
next.
Okay, here's one for you. What happens in the case of translating a text where the author has unfortunately passed away before the translation happens?
I think that goes to what I was talking about earlier in terms of the degree of involvement of the author gives us more flexibility. We'll call this the minimum possible involvement of the author. In that case, I think we would only take it on if we were pretty much ready to do it in a very, very faithful way. We wouldn't be looking to make posthumous edits with an author who wasn't available.
All the German authors that I have translated, they are all dead, so it's impossible to ask them about solutions. And one of them, Lichtenberg, who was a writer from the Enlightenment in the 18th century, he never meant to publish what he wrote, so those were his private diaries. And so there are a lot of confusing sentences that were meant just for himself. He even would write, I understand myself. When something was too complicated, he would write, I understand myself. So then you have to have, as a translator or as a German reader, the only solution is to have a guesstimation of what's going on there. No? So, of course, there are all kinds of critical studies about the possibilities of a sentence that can mean two different things and so on, but that's fascinating as well. No? It's trying to be as near as possible to somebody who was writing in secret. That was a private language. No? But if it's a language, it can be translated.
I haven't translated any dead authors, but I imagine it's very freeing.
second question was...
I have a question for Thomas. Often a translator should be familiar with the culture of the place where of the book. And I wanted to know if you were familiar with Latin America and Mexico in particular.
I spent all of 5 days in Mexico.
Okay, but so if not, how did you go about understanding Mexican culture, which is very different, of course, from...
Yeah. I've travelled in further south in Latin America a bit. You rely on the author for the things that are particularly idiomatic. And if the author's dead, then... Well, in fact, I have a sort of phone a friend person. She's actually Andalusian, but a friend of mine from when I lived in Spain, who I will invariably go to with things where I'm like, I don't really want to take this to the author, but you know, a few things.
I don't know if this isn't necessarily a Spain versus Latin America. I mean, I live in Madrid, so I'm much more familiar with the Castilian Spanish, although I've been translating a lot of Mexican writing lately, in part thanks to Conaculta because of being guest at the book fair. But the title of the book of Juan's that I translated, La Gota Gorda, is an extremely idiomatic expression that's very difficult in English, which comes from sudar la gota gorda, to put in a lot of effort. And it's literally to sweat a large droplet of sweat. You know, there isn't a nice, handy little way, and because it's an expression that doesn't exist, it was complicated. I mean, in this case, my translation was for the rights department, so it wasn't necessarily a publication one. I didn't have contact with Juan. We just met, 10 minutes before the panel started. Otherwise, but this was also one of the questions when I was asking him about whether he thinks about translation. One of the things that I think, one of the richnesses of his language is that it is so, he's writing in Spanish for a Spanish market so well, and using the richness of the language and of the Mexican Spanish, that then it's a nightmare for us as translators to have to deal with that or to try and recreate it. Like I know the title they're thinking of God is Round, talking about just the shape of the football. I know that Tom has some other things that in the essays he refers to. There was one example where you were like, this is the title, how do we do this in English? It was at the end of one of the samples that you had sent before the fair. So, I mean, being able to preserve or recreate that as much as possible is sort of one of the...
No, this wasn't so much a Latin American thing, but he talks about Maradona being el dios de los pies pequeños. And if you go for the god of small feet, then there's a sort of, for an English audience, there's the Arundhati Roy resonance. So I was suggesting twinkle-toed god, but that's something that sort of remains to be discussed.
I like twinkle-toed gods.
And it's kind of diminutive to Maradona, which as an Englishman is something that you always want to do.
So, one and then...
Cool. Can you hear me? Yeah. I find it really interesting when you talked about sort of your vision for the translation, and especially that you kind of mentioned specific writers that you would like to sort of emulate to get across the style. So I was kind of wondering whether that's something that you discussed or who kind of decides on the style of the translation, whether you can say a bit more about that.
I mean, so the question is sort of about, kind of establishing your stylistic kind of parameters early on. Yeah. If I understood correctly. I mean, basically you're informed by the writer themselves, the writing itself, and you follow that. But to me, this feels very appropriate because I'm thinking about the English readership, so to hang it stylistically on the likes of Barney Ronay or Jonathan Wilson seems right. But yeah, you'll quite often have maybe you will have already done a sample, or you'll do the first few chapters, and you'll have a conversation with the editor, with the publishers, to make sure that they're sort of in agreement, that it's sort of I'm doing another book at the moment, and the publisher has read it in French. He's fluent in French, but not in Spanish. So he's going to look at the first few chapters of what I've done, and then we're going to have a sort of editorial discussion of, does it align with how he sort of felt reading it in French? Is that?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I think that different publishers have different ideas about what they want. I mean, some publishers are very hands-off and they just want the translator to resolve everything and to actually do a lot of editing. I mean, this is one of the things that Juan was talking about, is that a lot of times in the Spanish language market, books are not edited by the publishers. And this is a complaint. I know that especially crime novels, it's a problem where the English language market is much more rigorous, and so very often there have been crime novels in Spanish language that I've done samples for, and the English publishers are just like, this needs a heavy edit. It's missing all this basic continuity problems, things like that. The Spanish language world isn't as used to doing that. I know a case where a Japanese novelist, many of the publishers translate off of the edited English. So because it goes through a very heavy editing process in English, and they prefer that clean, tightened version. So, but a lot of it, this is one of the things that very often translators have to do samples for publishers, but also as translators, we kind of need an editing sample of what the editor expects, how involved they want to be in that process or not, to make sure that we're on the same wavelength. Some editors will come in and change everything, and some will be just, they just want it to be delivered and then put it into production, sort of thing. So. Yeah. You had a question also?
I've been watching, and it just feels, as a translator, just a wonderful setup where you've got so many people who are interested in talking to each other about what the product is, and a collaborative process. I do quite a lot of social science translation, so history, anthropology, and stuff like that. And in many ways it's similar, because the nuance and the use of language is important, I think. And so when you have an author who wants to get involved, it's ideal. And yet I think it was probably a joke when you said your ideal author's a dead author, so you don't have to bother with the author. But I have spoken to some other literary translators who have said, no, the choice is mine. I'm the writer in English. I'm not going to have, if the author doesn't like what I've done, then tough. And I couldn't believe I was hearing that. And yet it seems to be true that successful translators might have that approach as well. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about that, especially because you said that you'd done a translation without having any contact. I know it wasn't for publication, so it's different, but a little bit around that, really.
Maybe just an example, not with what I translated of Juan's, but I've just been translating two different poets, both of whom are translators who have very excellent English. One is a Spanish writer, Jordi Doce, who's translated all of Paul Auster, Ted Hughes. His English is excellent. And it's been the experience, and the other was Elsa Cross, a Mexican poet. And the experience with both was really rewarding. Elsa's English is also very good. But they both have very different stylistic choices. Jordi wants everything to be as Anglo-Saxon as possible, and Elsa wants everything to be as Greco-Roman as possible. So it was interesting because I had just been finishing translating Jordi, so when I started working on the Elsa Cross, I was in this very Anglo-Saxon mode. The book I translated was called Bomarzo, which is set in the Garden of Grotesques in Italy, so it really made sense to be more Greco-Latin. And it was interesting, though, that very often we would debate nuances of words and things. This is not wrong, but can we please use this word or another word, which to me was a very enriching and rewarding experience, because it's not about trying to figure out, what is this in this language, but, just trying to make the best recreation and to, recreate the reading experience. Especially with Bomarzo, where she uses in the Spanish so many words, especially from the Greek. So that was something that we tried to recreate in the translation as well. So I don't know.
Well, I suppose it's sort of a spectrum whereby you can have an author with very good English, and that therefore they're likely to want to give input, and the input's really welcome and useful. And then, usually, if an author has no English, then you're going to be left to it. In the middle, it's potentially kind of the problem case where an author maybe thinks their English is better than it is, and they get their hands on the thing. But then, that tends to be a thing that's mediated between, you're not just there, fighting, having to explain what I imagine would be a very long-winded thing of having to explain to an author who doesn't have your language. It's you sort of work with the publisher to find solutions. Yeah.
My experience has been, temperamentally, it seems to me that translators want to be as authentic and as beautiful, but as faithful as possible. And I've often had the feeling in editing a translation that there's sort of, the best case scenario is when the translator is sort of the advocate for the writer and I'm the advocate for the reader, and we can sort of negotiate where we're going to land on certain things, and I think that's, and then that's, I think that gets to it can get to a good balance. But yeah, my experience, I haven't had an experience yet as an editor with a translator who really wanted to go off in a different direction from the writer, at least not that I'm aware of. On the most part, generally speaking, I would say I found myself pushing translators to be more assertive, to be to be more interpretive when something really needs it in order to get across. More often than not, I found translators resisting edits that I suggest because it doesn't feel literal or faithful, in the way that to the standard that they try to keep themselves. So. Yeah.
So as our moderator, I'm afraid we're out of time, but thank you all for joining us on this journey of how Juan's books and books in general wind up translated into English, and I'm glad that we have many more books by Juan to look forward to for the English-speaking audience, for those who cannot read them in the original. Thank you.
And I believe the book is still with the 2016.